Hello students, welcome to this video which is part of the series of videos relating to EDUCAS's English Language A-Level Component 1, Section B Language Issues. Today we're going to be looking at the standard and non-standard English option. I'm Chris and I'm joined here by Steve.
Hello.
And we're going to make the assumption that you've got a pretty good grounding already in the basic concepts of standard and non-standard English. We're also assuming that you understand the basic format of the question, which is that you're given a piece of stimulus material, like this one here, and this is a starting point which you'll respond to for anything from a paragraph to maybe half your answer. But then you have to develop your own arguments and develop further paragraphs and bring in material you've studied throughout the course, tailoring it precisely to the requirements of this question. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a number of pieces of stimulus material with some mocked up questions. These bits of stimulus material were provided by EDUCAS themselves. They came without questions, but we've written some, so we'll see how that goes. We're going to do this video in dialogue form, so you'll see there's a variety of different approaches to structuring your response and to deciding what content you're going to put forward. So let's have a look at our first piece of stimulus material. This is a really interesting extract. It's from a letter sent home by parents to a primary school in 2013. And it's got some quite extraordinary instructions, really. Let's read some of it. If you hear your child saying the following phrases or words in the left-hand column, please correct them using the phrase or word in the right-hand column. I'm sure if we tackle this problem together, we will make progress. And if we look down sort of this left-hand column, well, look at these titles first of all. Incorrect and correct. We're going to have to deal with that because what we're doing for the first section of our response is we have to come to terms with this stimulus material. So my first response here is that I think this is a sort of clear case of what might be called linguistic prescriptivism, the belief that there's a correct form of English that everyone should aspire to. By saying incorrect and correct, I mean, that really gives the game away.
Absolutely. I think as soon as you see those terms, you're thinking somebody's looking at language through a prescriptivist lens. They're definitely thinking about how things should and should not be. Mm-hmm. So you've got a set of examples here which I think are a good basis of your introductory paragraph.
Mm-hmm. And there's quite a lot of detail here. I mean, let's just have a look at some of them. I done that is regarded as incorrect. Now, because we are not linguistic prescriptivists, we tend to be linguistic descriptivists in that we accept language as we find it and just enjoy analysing and describing it. This term incorrect is a little bit, I suppose we would call it a pejorative way of referring to these terms. But let's look at I done that. This should be, according to this primary school, this should be I have done that or I did that. Now, I think there's a similar issue in the second example, I seen that. This should be I have seen that or I saw that. I think the issue is one here of grammar. Absolutely. I think you'd need to say what's going on with the language here. Mm-hmm. So with the first one, it's the dummy auxiliary and the tense which is being used. The second one, it's the form of the verb. Mm-hmm. And the tense in which it was being used, and you need to be able to identify that. Yeah. So this, we do use, done. We actually use in done the lexeme done in standard English. Mm-hmm. I have done. We can see it here. Yeah. And the issue is, the non-standard form, the incorrect form, is not using the auxiliary verb, and it's taking what I think is the past participle and using it in this simple past form, and it's the same situation here. I have seen, and then they offer the simple past form that I saw. Here it's the past participle form being used without an auxiliary verb, as if it was a simple past. Now, what's really interesting here is that this is such a consistent rule in non-standard forms of English that it kind of raises objections to the idea that it's simply incorrect. I'll repeat that, it's so consistent used that it kind of forms a standard. And here we are in the north of England, and that's used constantly, isn't it? And it almost, you could argue it's kind of like almost like a northern standard.
Absolutely, you could argue it's a rule of Northern English.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's a dialect form which is accepted in spoken form in the north of England.
Mm-hmm. Let's just continue it with use, because use, this is the second person plural pronoun. In standard English, as it says here, the word is never plural, we should say.
Yeah, they get very upset there, don't they?
They get very upset there. People get quite emotional about what they perceive as incorrect forms of English. But there's really good arguments for saying that the use form, which is used in, I think it's used in, certainly it's used in Liverpool.
Bits of Manchester.
And certainly bits of Manchester, yeah. It makes more sense in some ways.
Yeah.
In standard English, you, when it's used in a singular way, is exactly the same as you in the plural way, and there's no kind of difference to see there. Use helps you see that this is a second person plural, so it's doing something that standard English doesn't do, and it's quite helpful. And you do see it in other forms of English as well, like in southern United States, y'all. Mm-hmm.
I think it's quite important to point out there that frequently the non-standard form of the language can be more complicated than the standard form.
Mm-hmm.
So, and don't make an assumption that just because it's standard, it's therefore more sophisticated or more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Here you can see differentiating between the singular and plural is a more complicated way of using language.
Now, this document, it's got quite a variety of things it objects to. Now, here it's definitely sort of grammatical issues, but then it moves on to sort of pronunciation issues, dropping the th. It seems to say school finishes at 3:15. Should be school finishes at 3:15. Here it's a kind of definitely a phonological issue, a pronunciation issue, and therefore an accent issue. Similar in these ones, giz it here, please give it to me. I don't know, I don't know. There's other issues beyond grammar that are emerging here to do with pronunciation. I suppose I feel differently about grammatical standards and non-standards than I do about pronunciation. Pronunciation seems so embedded in who we are and where we're from that it seems such a small issue. And this is definitely kind of to do with spoken language rather than the written language. I mean, how do you feel about the idea that as teachers we should be picking students up on the way they pronounce things?
It's quite a tricky one, particularly that particular phoneme's tricky because in some accents they don't use the phoneme. They'll say t, as in Jamaican or Irish, they'll say tree.
Mm-hmm.
And free, I know someone who was a teacher who used to say free. He was an English teacher. But it was just part of his way he spoke. It was part of his idiolect.
Mm-hmm.
I guess they're getting at the fact that it maybe has an impression on people to whom you're speaking.
Mm-hmm.
They think it sounds infantile, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It goes on to things like, let's skip that one for the moment, but letter and butter. Letter and butter, that's kind of odd because there's so many things in. Now we move on to the idea of received pronunciation. It's a different idea to standard English, but the most prestigious pronunciation in Britain today is this one called RP, received pronunciation. That's not particularly, it doesn't reproduce the R sound, what I would call a rhotic R sound on the ends of words like centre. But there's a big objection to letter and butter. It seems like...
it doesn't even indicate how they should be pronounced. It just seems to suggest that there's a direct link between spelling and pronunciation, which we know there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, how are you supposed to say those in the correct column? Letter?
Yeah.
Are you going, so the more like if you're in Somerset or Bristol, then
Yeah.
it's not RP, is it?
Yeah, because RP is, on the whole, not non-rhotic.
Yeah.
So here the spelling, if we were to follow spellings exactly in terms of our pronunciation, we would be sounding more like we're from Somerset or
Absolutely.
Ireland.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
like that.
There's another one with the work and shirt as
Yeah.
well. I mean, what are they saying? That it should be shirt, work.
Yeah. So the whole document seems to be a real mixture of different anxieties about things, and
Yeah.
I think as I introduced it, it's to do with a kind of prescriptivism. I mean, prescriptivism goes right back to the 18th century, but here it is, alive and kicking in education. Just thinking about the sort of title you might be given. I mean, here's one potentially I've mocked up. Using this extract as a starting point, analyse and evaluate the proposition that certain forms of language should be discouraged by educational authorities. Or a similar one could be, another one could be, using the extract as a starting point, analyse and evaluate the argument that children should always be taught standard English to the exclusion of other dialect forms. So in your answer, you would start with a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, maybe even more, really addressing this very, very interesting information. But then we need to move it forward and start talking about some other ideas. And here we got, we have a challenge, don't we? We have to sort of think of paragraphs that might be doable.
Absolutely, and this is where you need to have not necessarily completely prepared paragraphs, but lots of data and ideas at your fingertips to then incorporate into one of these answers.
Mm-hmm.
So you're certainly going to have to know about prescriptivism.
Okay.
You're certainly going to have to know about some of the ideas that are here and what you think of them.
So just thinking about some areas we could address, we can move on to the whole prescriptivism versus descriptivism debate. Could be you could do a focus on that. That could form part of a paragraph, or maybe even a paragraph on its own.
Yeah.
There's the whole debate around standard and non-standard English, and I suppose there is an opportunity here to talk about sort of standard English and its perhaps even its history. That's a potential. We don't want to turn this into a language change essay, but a sense that standard English is just one dialect among others, but it has been awarded this privileged position. It is the result of historical processes. It isn't just the result of nature. We know that with the Caxton and the arrival of printing in England and the whole 18th century dictionary and grammar tradition, that standard English did emerge from particular historical circumstances, and it's really important to remember that dialect forms have existed just as long as standard English, or even longer. So maybe a kind of that kind of historical approach could be useful for a paragraph or two.
Definitely, I think that you need to understand that there are other forces around. There's not some kind of natural progression. The English public schools, the capital being in London and the universities in the southeast. They're all kind of influential forces that shape what standard English is and what people think about it. The BBC using RP accents and the people writing into Radio 4 with their views on this. There are lots of forces around which influence what we think is standard English and how people judge it. So I think that's a very important paragraph to put the standard English into context.
Now I know that many of our students here in sort of the Manchester area, they would describe themselves as being bidialectical and code switching between these different dialects. And I think there's quite a lot. There's potentially a way to move this towards writing about a dialect that So the Lancashire, sort of Manchester area dialect is full of interesting kind of content, and I think the idea here is that you could sort of move that along to sort of the idea of codes switching. I know that virtually every student we have in the college here would say something like I broke my pen rather than standard English I've broken my pen, but everyone's aware of both forms, and they may have an awareness like code switching or to respond to different situations.
Absolutely. I mean, you're doing A-level English, you're unlikely to write "I broke my pen" in your essay.
Mm-hmm.
You're more likely to use your standard English when writing an essay or in a formal situation, or a more formal, say, an academic interview or something like that. And you're much more likely to code switch into more mank when you're talking to your mates. And we're the same.
Yeah. So, I mean, this really could potentially be its own section then, the idea of code switching and sort of bidialecticalism. Okay?
Yeah, I think the key thing we're doing here is we started with this source extract, but we're going beyond it now. We're going into like the actual question, which is, forms of language, we should use this form or not that form. And that's the kind of the key idea that we're kind of exploring, really.
Now, I suppose we are starting to see potential paragraphs here. If we'd started at the top here with response to the stimulus, then we are starting to see potentially a response with a conclusion. All the time we will be seeking to try and answer this question. Is there anything missing? I'm thinking perhaps taking this back into the classroom. I know that there are some theorists that had some specific ideas. Some of you might remember Bernstein and elaborated and restricted code. That could be a kind of related topic. I know Milroy and Milroy were interested in this area too. Taking it back into the classroom might be a thing to do in order to answer that specific question. But we're starting to sort of develop a kind of game plan there. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. I think as well as some of these other ideas, I think it's important to answer the whole question and tackle that idea that it should be discouraged or it should be standard English should be taught to the exclusion of the dialects. You have to deal with that, and therefore you've got to deal with why they think this and why people think this. So you've got to think, well, hang on, in many contexts it is important to use the standard form, and in which context that would be appropriate. Really, just to tackle, I mean, we might find some of these a bit over the top, perhaps a letter and butter work and shirt, but to use standard English grammar in many contexts is going to be important. So I think we need a paragraph about that. I will put one in.
Okay, so let's move from this stimulus to something else.